A common theme which critics of established religions often fall back to is that if God is real, he is incredibly cruel, which for some reason or another they feel is reason enough to entirely disprove God's existence, or to prove it but discourage the worship of this God, which if the God in question was so cruel and malicious would surely be a bad idea, following their logic. But staying inside this net of logic these critics cast, is God incredibly cruel? What exactly do they mean by this? Is it that, to their understanding, the supposed God character allows the people within this world to endure things which they do not enjoy? Is it not possible that this is their own failing to see a higher picture of this? There are many ways this could be explored, but let's try a few. The first, God is cruel to be kind. The standard human system of understanding is often represented as a rigid die or trichotomy, positive and negative, or positive, negative, and neutral. If we agree, as the critics seem to, that cruelty, or the acts classed as cruelty, fall into the negative, and the inverse would be passion and care, etc., and neutrality would be the absence of either, then it can be seen quite quickly that without one of the two, or three, none of the others can exist with their current values intact. The act of being kind depends on the ability to be unkind, or neither kind nor unkind. If there was no ability for unkindness, then the value of the act deemed kind would simply be empty. It would just be an act of neutral value, without a negative to move away from, and then the people who act in this way would not be seen as good or kind, they would just be ordinary people. You could argue perhaps that being kind should simply be the way people are, not out of aim for virtue or higher standing. But then, in this world without values, there is nothing to aim towards or away from. In a world without kindness, there is only cruelty, and in a world without cruelty, there is only kindness. But in a world with only positive or negative, there is no positive nor negative. There is no orientation or heading to instruct people on how to be proper or virtuous in life. If then God is dismissed and life endures without his presence, what happens then when inevitably the negatives persist? Well, then we can decide that these negatives are either the work of another, greater force in the universe, some other spectre casting morality as good and bad, or is the conclusion which most unattended people arrive at, that there is no good or bad, there is only neutrality. Yet, for some reason, people still feel outraged at these negatives, even the critics of God, who blame this party for these negatives. The result, in absence of God, following the logical systems of the critics, is that 1. There must be another, external, moral force, or 2. There is no morality. The first is essentially a statement that there is no God, but there is a force which acts in essentially the same way as we blame God for acting. This is quite similar to the way one God is removed and replaced with another, more under the control of a new group installing the new God. The second removes all blame and responsibility for world cruelty, but still results in a pseudo-framework of morality. If the critic still feels a sense of good and evil, which for cruelty to exist must surely be present, this then points back to the first option, unless the critic agrees that the cruelty he is condemning is merely a whim of his to define, which undermines his argument entirely, as he would then be simply calling himself the God under critique, a figment of his own imagination, which again points back to the first option. The second argument. Cruelty is not human. It is almost exclusively the way for humans to perceive the world that the world is as it is perceived. To criticize God as cruel and wrong assumes that mankind, or the critic at least, has a full understanding of God, which through most logical narratives of God, including the ones which critics critique, would require the critic to be positioned above God, or simply to be greater in the broad sense. This has two main flaws. First, to be greater than God, if God is in fact God which they are critiquing, would imply that the critic is in fact ultimately responsible for God's actions, or more so, knowledgeable of them and unwilling to interrupt them, which then quite cleanly places the critic as the immoral, cruel, godlike being, but also through their own extended logic essentially proves the existence of God as they critiqued him. Secondly, to assume oneself as above or in a position to accurately critique God, or a godlike force, implies that the critic is again greater or broader than God, and has full, exhaustive knowledge of the entire universe, and all existence across time, which the God they critique apparently has. If they did not have at the very minimum this expanse of knowledge, they would only be judging a partial representation of God, which, as most humans have agreed upon from within their existing framework of good and evil, is that to judge without full knowledge is not a fair judgment, This would be something like blaming a tree for being cruel because the wind blew it down and hurt somebody. This is a difficult topic to engage in due to the impossibility of total knowledge as I've outlined in the previous statements, but the conclusion I have drawn with my limited expanse of information is that 1. Eventually all paths lead to God's existence, or something similar to a godlike force. 2. There is no God, thus there is no morality, and cruelty is entirely the responsibility of mankind, and to criticize God is an attempt to shirk this burden.